Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the morning session today. We've had, I hope, very productive breakout group sessions. It's the breakout groups discussed data needs, but I'm sure you know that there were also general issues about the approach that must have come up. So I think what we are going to do now in this session is, as usual, have feedback from the various working groups presented by the rapporteurs. We'll have a general discussion on the issues related to data needs. Then we will have a lunch break of an hour and come back for the very short wrap-up session. To see if we have, come to a complete picture of what take-home message we got from you, and then we can close the meeting and with a great appreciation for all of what you have done during those 2 days. So with that, let me start by asking one of the rapporteurs to give us a feedback, and again to make a little bit of a change. We'll start with Group C. The Group C chaired by Dominique, and Hermolaus is the rapporteur. So please, Hermolaus, you have the floor. Hermolaus, are you there? If not, maybe we should start with Group B then. And I'll see if Claudia Cascio is there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, Claudia, please go ahead, and then I'll go to Hermolaus as second. So please, Claudia, go ahead.
Let me share my screen. I think, is it good, or do you have issues with the gray boxes?
There are no gray boxes today. Thank you.
All right, then time to start. Again, today we had a very interesting and proficient discussion, and I will try to summarize the key points. When it came to the discussion about the current data available for the proposed approach or modified approach proposed for risk-benefit assessment, okay, so we realized that we agreed on the fact that current methods can be used, but data might not be sufficient to support that. And this is more of a case-by-case situation. And we realized that the data might be missing both for the risk characterization and benefit characterization side. But not only. There will be a bit of examples following. For instance, in the case of emerging contaminants, and we know that globalized resourcing of ingredients is increasing this issue, data might be missing both for the hazard and exposure side. There was also a quote of the possibility to use health statistic data, and of course the need of using those response data, and again the availability of such data can vary largely on a case-by-case. Chemical occurrence data in food, and here are very precious data, and here we quoted the well-known EFSA data warehouse, where the contaminants, for instance, the contaminants levels in food are taken and are collected for the different, to fit the different EFSA opinions, and as well as we quoted the fact that there is a need for high quality detailed food composition data for having information and data on nutrients occurrence. We touch upon the certain limitations of the chemical data, chemical occurrence data, such as sometimes in the contaminant field, the high amount of left sensor data that might limit the exposure assessment to chemical contaminants. But this is then something that is very specific for risk assessment. So we then move to other issues that can be relevant for the risk-benefit assessment. In the field of consumption data, again, we quoted a precious source of information that is the EFSA Comprehensive Food Consumption Database. However, we also know that changes in diet are changing the habits of consumers, and therefore the collection of the continuous collection of such data is very important to capture those changes. There was a proposal, there was a recognized issue, the fact that age groups are sometimes not harmonized among institutions. So, for instance, there was the quote of the difference in the age classes used by the WHO and the EFSA ones. So there was a proposal of harmonization of such age groups to make, to be more on the same pace. There was also a quote to the work of the NDA, one of the piece of work of the NDA EFSA panel on the hazard benefit characterization for nutrients, and they are engaged in translating biomarkers levels. I think there was a quote on plasma levels into nutrient intakes. So this might be one of the possible approaches to use. And then we also had a discussion on the lack of data on the consumer perception side. So for instance, data on consumer awareness of the different type of foods and food ingredients, and as well data on the acceptance of new formulated foods by the consumers. Furthermore, data on the consumer side is missing on how consumers respond to advice given by authorities in this field. And those type of data can be very helpful when targeting specific communication to different populations. As well as we recognize the importance of risk and benefit communication to those to consumers. I'll try to move to the next slide, and I hope to be successful in that. Oh Lord, yes. Data gaps have been recognized also in the field of bioactive compounds. Again, the same thing on the hazard side, the benefit side, intake, consumption, occurrence, and so on. But also there was a recognized missing clarity on the definition of what a bioactive compound is in different fields. Again, food composition, we discussed about food composition. I think I touched upon this earlier on, so I will not spend more on this. Range of beneficial intake. So there was also discussion if on the advice that if you double the intake of a nutrient, is still this good for your health? And there was a discussion of the on this side on the possible lack of occurrence data, but also on the dose response on tolerable upper levels. And there was also a quote to some ongoing activities of the NDA panel on this. Deficit of data on functional ingredient and bioactive compounds, the difficulty of establishing sometimes upper levels for such compounds. And then there was a recognized need of more data on processed foods and possibly including on also data on the microbial side. We had a very interesting discussion on what are the additional data needed to be generated, and the group focused on, again, on the concept that to inform risk-benefit assessment, there is a need to englobate, to use mechanistic data. And there was an explicit discussion and quoting on AOPs, and especially we asked if can AOP help to characterize the benefit rather than the hazard effect. Also, can QSAR help in the characterization of the nutrient? So not only for the toxicological part, but also for the nutrient side. One of the speakers, one of the participants proposed to use the 10 key characteristics for carcinogenics as an example of framework that can be used to organize AOP data to draw conclusions. And maybe if you want to know more about this, I think you can ask later in the Q&A section. However, although everybody in the group recognized the importance of the use of AOPs, there was also the question, the issue, how much AOPs are currently used in the regulatory arena? Are they in use, or is it more sort of approach for looking at the future of risk and benefit assessment, risk and risk benefit assessment? Also, at the end, the group came to the idea that if we would have different AOPs, each linked to different outcomes, being accepted in the regulatory field, can this be the common metrics for the future to balance risk and benefit of hazard to chemicals and other chemicals and nutrients? Also, there was a recognition to the fact that no perfect data, of course, can fit everything, but different data can address different research questions, and probably the combination of epidemiological and mechanistic data will be the solution. This linked to the problem that, of course, epidemiological data are long in time to be generated and costly. So this links indeed to the next question: is how can we generate data, and who can provide resources? The group discussed the fact if this is this already a priority in the public health sectors for competent authorities and research institutions and member states, and everybody, we came to agreement that this should be a joint effort, so the gap should be filled by joint actions, European Commissions, but also member states, and so on. And there was an explicit quote to certain projects like the Park Initiative to engage member states in working close together for fulfilling the European Commission priorities in this field. And that's it from my side. I would like to ask Joseph if he wants to add anything on this.
Thank you, Claudia, for this presentation. I think you captured all the points very well. It was a very lively discussion, and in the end, we were running out of time. So I think I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, thank you very much, Claudia, for a very interesting presentation, and really, I think you presented as lively as probably your discussion has been. So thank you very much. Let's move on. I would just like to move to the group A now, and we'll ask Bernard Botex if he is ready to share.
Yes, good morning, Maged. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Just trying to share my screen. Alors, così, hop, and then I need to reduce this box. Can you see something?
Yes, we see the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So, good morning again. regarding group A, we started from the observation that often the actual risk assessment or the benefit assessment for the compounds of interest will already have been done. So there was the recommendation to have access to structured databases to get the relevant info for the compound subject of interest. So the reference points, the critical effect behind the reference points, and the reference values that have been established for those compounds. And a couple of examples for such databases were given, like the EFSA Open Food Tox, the US EPA Comp Tox Chemistry dashboard. And in the case of data poor compounds, suggestion to consult also some other types of databases, for example, for NAM data, so including in vitro data for the relevant endpoints, and that's the EPA CompTox database as well. And also to make use of in silico tools such as QSAR models that may also be used to fill in some of the data gaps. And in the parentheses, you see some of those tools like Vega, for example, that is existing. Then the group discussed the issue of the representativity of the occurrence data, especially in the case of contaminants, because it's more or less always it's a limited number of countries who are sending a lot of the occurrence data. For example, Germany, while others are not. There you don't have occurrence data for some of the EU countries. And this will create a problem when you do a regional risk benefit assessment. For example, if you try to combine consumption data from Scandinavian countries only with the occurrence data from these Scandinavian countries, because then the number of data available for your risk benefit assessment will drop significantly. But it was discussed that this does not necessarily lead to a big bias for your assessment. First, because there is a kind of intensive exchange of goods throughout Europe. And usually when you identify significant variation between your the regional outcome of the assessment as compared to what you would have got from an EU assessment, this is usually described and taken into account in the EFSA assessment. About, then we clarified further about the use of national data versus the use of EU data. So for example, if you have 20 analytical data from Sweden compared to 500 data from all over Europe, there is a paper that has been published that shows actually that the second option leads to more robust results. So even if you use data that are not Sweden specific, of course, the ideal situation would be to have a lot of data for the country of interest. And this is an issue, so for which EFSA launched a call recently for further improvement regarding the collection of occurrence data for the various European countries and the compounds, various compounds of interest. So everybody should be encouraged to submit occurrence data for their respective countries. We briefly touched on the use of epidemiological data, that they are usually representative of they use representative cohorts of specific population groups, but they can hardly be extrapolated to the whole population. So that's the limitation, but it was noticed as well that they are still more representative than rodent data in any case, so they should be considered for sure. When it comes to exposure data, it was one aspect is to collect data for the various age groups, and it was noticed that in EU menu, for example, the data collection stops at the elderly level, so you don't have anything for the very elderly. About the identification of classification of food, that should be based on the FoodX2, so that we have we are able to compare all the information coming from the various member states. EU menu contains data for around 24, 26 countries, but it is mostly based on open-ended 24 hours recall or dietary surveys. Because of this, you rely on the memory of the respondents, so they, in some cases, you actually don't get the granularity or the precision of the food item that you would expect. So the fish species, for example, will be undefined. So this is good. The 24 hours recall or dietary survey, they are good for short-term exposure, but they are not so good when we are interested in long-term exposure. And it was mentioned that a possible solution is the food frequency questionnaire. But here again, the problem is that it works only for targeted and limited number of foods, so you have a different granularity level. So, and it is a suitable tool for the purpose of close-ended questions like how often do you eat fish? So you don't go to the fish species, but this is also an information that you will need for the risk-benefit assessment. Then one suggestion, we are a bit out now of the risk-benefit assessment methodology, but it's to, when you do your dietary advice related to fish, the suggestion is to consider 2 food frequency questionnaires, one before the advice and one after, to get a feedback on the effect and whether the dietary advice was taken into account by some, if not all, of the population groups of interest. One aspect also is to get a higher granularity on the survey respondent characteristics, for example, information on body weight, pre-existing chronic diseases, etc. That would be needed to interpret the consumption patterns, let's say, and the effects in those populations. What additional data need to be generated? The toxicokinetic information could be useful also for the purpose of risk-benefit assessment, but it has not been structured systematically in the available databases, so this is a limitation. The identification of molecular markers from in vivo and epi studies, both for hazards and benefits, can be the basis for the design of in vitro experiments, which would generate some lines of evidence with regards to mode of action and adverse outcome pathways, and support the weight of evidence approach for both hazard and benefits. And it was mentioned, of course, that more human studies on the health effects, whether adverse or beneficial, of the whole food consumption is needed. So not moving away from the single compound approach, but look at the effect of the whole food. How can new needed data be generated? This has been partly answered already before. When it comes to occurrence exposure data, this is really to be generated by the member states, and all of them, and with the support of EFSA. We are going in that direction. One issue was discussed is the problem of the participation rate, which is low, especially for dietary surveys. And there was also the questioning about the representativeness of the people responding to the survey, the representativeness for the whole population. So what about those who are not interested in responding to surveys? Now, we don't go anymore to the phone survey, but even web questionnaire, it does not work for all European countries, or all age groups, or all social classes within a population. So there is research ongoing on possible solution to address this problem. Finally, it was mentioned that for the purpose of risk-benefit assessment, it's often not necessary to generate new data. If you think about the example of fish, we have plenty of them, if not too many already there. The main issue is mostly whether the occurrence consumption data are up to date and representative for the granularity you want to achieve with your risk-benefit assessment. And I think that's it, Thor. I don't know if you want, and Jean-Loup as well, if you want to add something that I would have missed or complement what I said.
I think you captured everything, basically, at least from my point of view.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Bernard. I think you also had a very rich discussion. Some overlap in terms of your the conclusion, but you have also a different angle that you've taken. So it's very interesting, to combine all of those at the end. Thank you very much. Thanks to the working group as well, to the outbreak group as well. I will now move to Group D, and I will ask Jean if he is willing to share the presentation now.
Yes, I will do.
Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good morning. We are on the edge. Okay, you can see my slides?
Yes.
Well, again, thanks to Heather, who was really chairing well after some connection problems in the morning. But we could really quickly start with the discussions. Also thanks to Jose, who was joining me in being the rapporteur. Okay, so we were, let's say, having quite some discussion about what kind of data we have and what could be, let's say, looked at for the future, and certainly within the context of risk-benefit assessments that we can expect. And well, we need always more data. That was, let's say, what everyone said. Of course, you always want to have a better database for the nutrients and contaminants exposures in particular. We need to look at monitoring of nutrients in different countries. And maybe, and this is something that is probably to be looked at, we need to have probably some further harmonization of what is being done in the different countries in the context of national food consumption surveys. What kind of nutrients are we talking about? What kind of vitamins and minerals are taken into the strategy of the surveys? And this is maybe a point for action that we have to consider. And I think this is also maybe something that EFSA should take into consideration. Influence of processing, we were having some discussions about, we should of course look at let's say, exposures to contaminants and nutrients in foods as consumed. And that is of course something which is normally done in total diet studies, but are we taking the processing sufficiently into consideration? It can affect, of course, the levels of contaminants and nutrients that we can, let's say, expect in different types of food. We have some food consumption data gathered by EFSA from the different member states, but maybe this is to be looked at as well. More tailor-made information could be useful, and particularly, of course, this is connected to where we need to have a good interaction with the risk manager in the beginning. What kind of, let's say, focus the risk-benefit assessment would need. And maybe this is leading to tailor-made aspects to be considered in the risk-benefit assessment. And Dieter was mentioning the perchlorate opinion of the content panel, where there were some targeted questions formulated by the working group who was dealing with it, and particularly with respect to intake of iodine in the population. There are, of course, and that is what we know, there are different methods for measuring food consumption. We have different methodologies, and it is quite well known that each of them, they have particular advantages and disadvantages, but maybe this is probably, let's say, something that we have to keep in consideration. And there was a particular element that we need to link with other sources of information. And particularly here, we are talking about the food industry. It's always, let's say, we have always the impression that we have probably much more data in the food industry about the composition of foods. And particularly there, we probably need to think about maybe even strengthening the linking with the food industry in particular. But we will come back to that later in other slides as well. EFSA has food composition data and data on levels of contaminants and nutrients, but what we are probably missing is really information from the different member states on the nutritional status. Are we looking at this? We have to think about this. And we were talking about the DALIs. What is the, let's say, underlying assumption being used in, let's say, estimating DALIs? Are we having differences between the way that the DALIs are estimated in different countries? I think that WHO was indicating we have, let's say, at international level, some harmonization, but maybe also here EFSA could maybe further collaborate with the EU agencies. That is what we are certainly aiming at, also to be considered at the EFSA conference in June. But I think that this is probably something that we need to look at. If we are going to DALIs, and which is still a possibility, a common metric that we can use for risk-benefit assessments, is this, let's say, a harmonized approach that we are taking on board? More focused data, there should be a mechanism to carry out data mining from national inventories and databases. Always during the risk assessment or risk-benefit assessment process, we probably can expect that we need to have some focused data, because we are looking at maybe particular target populations, and this is maybe something that could, let's say, imply that we maybe need some other tools and mechanisms to do additional steps to gather the data that we need, coming from national inventories, databases, as and it was. Let's say, for example, now we have in the scientific committee working groups working on copper and fluoride. We have those questions, and sometimes we really need to look into the possibility to have more specific data for which we have a data gap identified during the process. And there are different and opposite approaches for estimating health outcomes for contaminants and nutrients, and this is probably also this needs to be considered in the methodologies that we would like to take on board in risk-benefit assessments. Yeah, there was a consideration of what kind of data are we producing, and probably how are we considering these data into, let's say, the assessments that we are conducting. And probably here, we probably have to look at more human data. Well, it was already indicated in previous reports back that the use of human data could probably be, let's say, more useful, because we are not rodents. So we need to have, let's say, a closer look into what kind of data can we have from a human point of view, and take those into consideration. Of course, with all the caveats that we have in using epi data, sometimes very difficult to derive those response relationships on the basis of the available epidemiological data. And José Tarazona, he was pointing us at, there was a PPR opinion on findings of a scientific report on a literature review of AP studies and possible relations with exposure to pesticides. And that is, of course, something that that kind of information, that kind of, let's say, knowledge we could take on board. In chemical risk assessment, we are increasingly making use of mechanistic data, and probably we should do this also for the nutrients. Benefit outcome pathways was given as a sort of term that we could use, and the use of NAMs in order to better understand the mechanistic background of the beneficial effects of nutrients. Studies on the benefits of nutrients is fine, but the the status of the nutritional supply in different countries may exist, but probably we are not collecting this. But I think that this needs to be checked. I think that I was already mentioning this before. Levels in foods as consumed, going back to what was previously also indicated, we should have a look at, let's say, those levels of contaminants and nutrients in foods as consumed. And this is normally done in total diet surveys. But also here, the question was raised, but are we, let's say, preparing these foods for in these kind of surveys in the way that everyone is doing? There might be lots of variation, as you all probably can expect. Exposure to contaminants and nutrients through consumption of products marketed by the food industry is not always covered. And particularly, we are talking here about, well, those food products which are manufactured and making use, for instance, for contaminants. They're using oils and fats which are coming with shiploads to the different companies. And these oils and fats, they will be refined before they will be incorporated in foods. And that may also influence levels of contaminants and nutrients. But often in not total diet surveys, it's not always covered. And I think that that is leading to caveats that we are not covering those products in the form of cookies, in the form of prepared foods that you can purchase in the supermarkets, and which can be an additional source of exposure to the population. Important to also, we can do a lot in let's say, setting up new surveys for that would be supportive for future risk-benefit assessments. But it is, I think, key, and that was what everyone in the group was pointing at. It is key to set priorities, to define what we have to do, and which methods and data are really required to do this. Which kind of risk-benefits assessments do we need to do? And then, of course, we have to define what kind of methodology and data we are going to involve in the assessment. It's key, of course, again, repeating what we were discussing yesterday, that we have a proper interaction, not only in the beginning, but also during the process of the risk-benefit assessment with risk managers in order to direct, let's say, the groups doing the assessments in the most appropriate way. TDS for contaminants and nutrients should be promoted and harmonized. This is really, let's say, emphasized by the whole group. We need to do that. We need to think about what kind of nutrients we are talking about, what kind of selections we have to include for the contaminants. But certainly it should be more focused, let's say, on a balance between the contaminants and nutrients for the risk-benefit assessment. And future surveys should be changed probably in terms of study design to include also those relevant nutrients. Food consumption, we may need to look at also at subpopulations, but linking of these data with internal exposure through human biomonitoring studies was also mentioned, let's say, earlier by the other groups. And maybe a good start would be to define a clear roadmap to achieve what is needed for risk-benefit assessment, and with lots of money, maybe. Okay, and then the last slide. Well, again, repeating, combining TDS for contaminants and nutrients, linking with human biomonitoring and biomarker studies, and of course, taking on board not only AOPs, but also the benefit outcome pathways that might be considered useful for future risk-benefit assessments. Of course, what will we do with all these data that was mentioned by Jacqueline? I think it is, again, the interaction in the problem formulation and during the process, which is crucial to set priorities, and certainly already in front of this, ahead of all the risk-benefit assessments, what is really of priority to be done in the area of risk-benefit assessments. And of course, well, the goal would be to transfer all the information to the risk manager in identifying and comparing risks and benefits, not only for the general population, but certainly also for relevant subpopulations, and particularly this for the consideration of measures to be taken by the risk manager and for developing dietary advice. This is it for Group D. Maybe Heather and Jose, and maybe the group would like to add some additional information.
No, not from me, thanks, Jean. That was great. You covered all the discussion that we had. It was an interesting and engaging discussion. Thank you for doing that.
Same for me. Nothing, Jim. You have covered everything.
Thank you so much. And back to Maggot.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. Thanks, Heather. Indeed, I mean, Heather, you managed to steer the group in terms of the discussion into really a streamlined one, which is really admirable. And Jean, your presentation was brilliant, like all of our rapporteurs. And the two things that I find really intriguing and interesting among all the others are the idea of a benefit outcome pathway. I think this is really something new, and it also helps us make use of NAMs and feed into mechanistic data. So I think that is one additional item beyond what others have discussed. Thank you very much. And with that, I will move on to the last group for the morning, and that is Group C. Molaus, you would have been the first, but unfortunately, somehow you were not transferred in time. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yeah, we see the screen. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, indeed, there was a small technical issue, but it was overcome. So we had also quite some interesting discussions in Group C, and we tackled and we discussed many different aspects. So regarding the currently available data and how to use them, it was highlighted that there are difficulties currently in comparing risk-benefit assessment outcomes among countries, and these difficulties have to do with differences regarding how the data used are generated and how the data used are collected, because in some cases in risk-benefit assessments, for data from literature have to be used. A limitation in using data, food composition data from literature is that in some cases these data are scarce or they don't even exist. In some other cases, the literature's data may not be representative or not comparable among them, and maybe the quality of how this data have been produced can be questioned. So there was a question, when we don't have data, is it okay to produce the data in the lab in order to perform the risk-benefit assessment? In certain cases, it was discussed that this is a step to be considered even before starting the risk-benefit assessment exercise. But it was also highlighted that such approach may have limitations or even introduce bias to the exercise and the outcome due to the representativity of the samples analyzed. Then our discussion focused on the food consumption data. It was discussed that such kind of data are available in some member states, but the approach on how these data were collected was not always harmonized. It was highlighted that individual food consumption data, meaning raw data, at national level should be accessible in order to enable more risk-benefit assessment exercise of higher quality and giving more flexible outcomes. And the accessibility issue is present nowadays. And then there was a question, when we don't have food consumption data, what do we do? Then it was discussed that we can even stop the risk-benefit assessment exercise if we consider that what is asked to be done, for what is asked to be done, the composition data are crucial, from a specific country, specific region, or specific population. Or we say that we can use existing data, for example, from other countries, other populations, but considering the limitations and the uncertainties that may be introduced in the exercise and the outcome, or we need to perform a targeted new data survey to collect such data. Then we discussed about those response data And it was highlighted that there is a qualitative difference between the fields of nutrition and toxicology. This difference lies mainly on the nature of this dose-response data. Randomized controlled trials regarding compounds of toxicological concern cannot be performed due to mainly ethical issues. So a solution is to focus on using human data from human observational studies, but also integrating the risk-benefit assessment model data from animal studies. Then the group discussed aspects on the epidemiological evidence in nutrition, and more specifically issues raised were the availability and quality of studies, the existence of confounding factors, the risk of bias present in some of these studies, but it was highlighted that the meta-analyses are very helpful for risk-benefit assessment exercises. Then we discussed about what additional data need to be generated. Regarding food composition, it was highlighted that we need more data regarding nutrients and contaminants, especially when the risk-benefit assessment scenario includes novel or less commonly used foodstuff. More specifically for contaminants, it was highlighted that such data should be generated at a national level, but for nutrients, the case is different because nutrients can be extrapolated from existing food composition databases. Regarding minor components related to nutrition, it was highlighted that the currently existing food consumption databases, they usually cover macronutrients and a vast array of micronutrients, but more effort to collect data on minor components relevant to nutrition is needed. Then the group discussed the needs regarding food consumption data, and it was highlighted that this data must be country-specific and produced under the same or comparable methodological frameworks. We discussed also the total diet studies and that they need to be performed for population exposure assessment, and that this is not currently available in all member states. Then another topic, another area of discussion was the dose-response relationships, and that we need to produce more evidence of this kind regarding characterizing the dose-response effect between components and health outcomes. An interesting discussion was conducted regarding the biomarkers of effect, and we discussed that there is a need to understand how to validate them and how to use them. And we should understand the mechanistic pathway in order to do so. We also discussed that the usefulness of dietary indexes in relation to health outcomes, for example, inflammation, but the group decided that more discussions are needed in order to understand if such evidence could be taken on board. Then, in the last part of our discussion, we discussed how this new data should be generated, who will do, how this will be done. One interesting point is the literature food mining. It's something that needs to be explored and advanced in order to meet better the needs of data collection and also data usage, also considering the use of artificial intelligence. The idea of the group is that research needs and frameworks should be established via a collaborative approach between the European Union and member states, and then it should be the European institutions leading the creation and methodological approach, which should be said by public consultation. Then funding acquisition should be via EU funds towards all the member states in order to ensure that all of them can proceed with the generation and collection of this data despite possible country-related limitations that may exist. For example, different policy needs, different agendas, limitations regarding funding. And it was highlighted that a really nice example towards this direction was the EU menu project. Maybe I'm sure many of you will already know it. And this project launched by EFSA foresee that EFSA provides both financial and technical support to EU member states, but also to pre-accession countries in order to carry out dietary surveys and collect this food consumption data. So overall, this was a summary of what has been discussed in Group C. I would like to invite Domenico, Claudia to complement the discussion if something should be highlighted, but thanks a lot.
Amalo, thank you very much. You did a great job. As for the two other breakout sessions, so I have nothing to add. That's a really nice summary of our discussions. Thank you.
Dominic.
Thank you very much, Amalaus, and also again to the working group, to the breakout group. It's, again, an amazingly rich discussion and was very well presented. Thank you very much. And what I'm always surprised with is how much can a small group of scientists gathered together get out in 2 hours. I mean, and then you know, every group came from a different angle. There are many commonalities, but also some additional issues that were discussed in each. So it's really a very heartening observation to see that. So thank you again. And I think now that we can open to the open up for discussion. As usual, please use the chat. Some have already started while people are talking. And I will then take some of the issues. Let me start with a question, not a question, actually an observation made concerning the need for epi data, particularly for Group B. It came up when Group B was presenting. So epi data are generated over the whole of Europe, and that there is quite a bit of funding provided by the European Commission to generate data. And then there are, of course, other sources of epi data focused on certain adverse outcomes of regulatory concern. These are observations that Jakob van Klaver made. And so maybe I'll ask Group B, so Joseph or Claudia, if you would like to comment here.
Well, I think there are, as you said, commonalities, maybe sometimes expressed slightly different. So one group was, for instance, asking for a benefit outcome pathway, which I see slightly different, because to me, an adverse outcome pathway is not directly linked to the nature of the chemical, but it's just leading from an initiating event along number of key events to an adverse outcome. And that may be triggered by one chemical, but the so-called beneficial substances will well interact with this key event and may prevent that it proceeds to an adverse outcome. So I see that as a commonality actually for both the toxicants as well as for the beneficial substances. And that's why our group sort of asked the question whether that could actually be considered as a sort of a common metric, looking for interference with the same adverse outcome pathway. Because as we discussed yesterday, it's also a definition what to mean by a benefit. A benefit, in my view, always prevents having an adverse outcome, meaning also maintaining health. So if you know how a disease is occurring through an adverse outcome pathway, then that could integrate both substances which would interact with that pathway, leading to an adverse outcome, but also a beneficial substance which strengthen the pathway, not leading to the adverse outcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. So I think what you're referring to is really the fact that you can use the adverse outcome pathway also to show the benefits through the interaction in terms of, you know, interacting at various points within the pathway. And I think that is a very interesting and very appreciated approach. But maybe since we...
And
yeah,
to
sorry,
me,
Joseph?
that also would integrate the data we get from epidemiology, meaning what kind of health outcome are of concern, and linking that again back to mechanistic data, which is then leading to understanding to this adverse outcome. So it's integrating almost everything.
Yeah. No, thank you, Joseph. But since we touched on the benefit outcome pathways that were proposed, and there is a bit of discussion in the chat, I will ask Jose if he would like to address this issue. But when you do that, please note that there is a comment that somebody is finding this idea super interesting, but there is an issue with proving causation from association that is certainly more challenging in the field of nutrition than it is on the field of toxic events. And then, in addition, except for diseases that are caused by, say, a single gene defect, it is very difficult to isolate which components of a certain disease phenotype are related to an isolated nutrient. So, of course, this is absolutely a correct observation, but maybe Jose, if you can highlight your ideas about the BOP. Jose, please.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, first, I'm in toxicology, so I will say that it's also very difficult to set causality for contaminants in particular. There is not just a single element. The approach of AOP was to try to put a frame just to try to facilitate that. We know that there are not linear AOPs. In reality, all chemicals, all contaminants will have a network of AOP affecting many molecular initiating events and key events. I see the logic from Joseph. We have basically is how which kind of which side of the coin you see if benefits are considered just as increase in health or just reducing adversity. But the concept as AOP are chemically agnostic, I see that can be done in a similar way. I do not see differences implemented as AOPs and putting the beneficial effects there versus considering beneficial AOPs or the outcome for beneficial. I cannot answer that because that is outside my expertise. I saw a comment on the non-monotonicity for the nutrients, but just to be clear, there is also a possibility for non-monotonicity, particularly at these intermediate events for contaminants as well. So there is something there that that is already also in the opinion of the scientific committee on non-monotonicity. There was particularly there was 10 examples in the area of nutrients looking for this kind of beneficial effects of nutrients versus in general or in relation to toxicity, and non-monotonicity was observed for these health effects, because if the level of nutrients start to be so high, then what you see is the toxicity of this nutrient instead of the beneficial effect that was expected. So I see options there. It was just an idea, but the development will need to be followed by experts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I'll give the floor to Joseph. I think he will react to what you said. Joseph?
Either you react or I react, because, well, for the nutrients are a specific area, and referring to non-monotonicity with nutrients in a generic way, I think is not correct, because the endpoints you are looking at are different. So you are looking at at least two different dose response curves, one leading to deficiency or avoiding deficiency, and the other when toxicity starts. So in a strict sense, for my understanding, this is not a non-monotonic dose response. And the other point which just triggered me, the question, it's a philosophical question, but if you are healthy, is there such a thing that getting healthier than healthy? I mean, if you're healthy, then you're healthy. How would you get even more healthy? What is that? You can impair your health, but then we are again talking about sort of an adverse outcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. I think these ideas are worth consideration, and in particular, you know, the non-monotonicity but at least, you know, micronutrients is really an overlay of two monotonic dose response curves in general. So here there have been, of course, the idea of surveys was brought up in several groups, particularly Group B. And then the question was really, and it was brought up, I think, by, well, so some other groups, as far I can't remember which. So there is one comment saying that, you know, surveys should also consider supplement use, which is one thing. But there is also the question, if groups that are not interested in responding to surveys, would they be actually interested in following risk management advice at all? Or is it just that they are too lazy to respond but will follow if an advice is given? So actually, are we targeting the right population when we send surveys, the population that will follow the advice or not? I think it's a little bit of a philosophical question. So I wonder if maybe maybe either Tua or Heather would like to respond to that.
Can you repeat the question?
And I think Dominique has an experience as well. It's actually whether those interested in, not interested in replying to surveys would be actually following risk management advice. And if you want to have a little think about it, I can pass on to Davide for a moment and then come back to you. So Davide, please.
Yes. Can you hear me? I hope.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting question. I mean, the scarce participation to surveys is an issue for all type of surveys, and in particular for the food consumption one, for which there is quite, that is quite demanding for participants. But I would say that the main problem here, as far as we have seen in the latest surveys, is that people is currently too much solicited the participation to different surveys. And also people is scared that at the end you want to sell them something. So I would not link this scarce participation to the possibility that people will not follow the advice. If the advice is well given, if it comes from a trusted source, I mean, there are many other, I'm not a sociologist, but I would say that the two things are not strictly related. Of course, also if people will follow the advice is another issue and should be studied, but I would not link the scarce participation to the following of the advice. And since I have the floor, I would like to point out, I have seen in the different presentation some comment on the harmonization of the dietary surveys. I think that we have done a lot in this remit. I think that the data are quite harmonized. A new project has been now launched to further harmonize the EU menu phase 2. The data are available at individual level, at least at EFSA. And then something else that I wanted to point out is that also in the area of food composition data, There is a lot of work to be done here, but also in this case, EFSA just started a new project. We launched a procurement, and I put the reference in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. I would have asked you actually to refer to those points that you raised as well. So thank you for doing it now. Heather, please.
Yeah, it was really just to say that I'm probably not the right person to answer that question, Magid, I'm afraid. But I think it would be challenging to get people who, you know, to pay advice to things if they're not interested. That's the end of it.
Right. No, I mean it's just because it was brought up in Group D as well. That's why I referred to you. But yeah, I think Davide gave a very good answer to it, and I think Tua will complement it now. Tua, please. Tua, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I think the methodology behind 24-hour recall and dietary assessment methods, the sort of people have been very quite slow in developing these surveys with time. I mean, the digital platform and everything. And today you cannot really, young people don't answer the phone in certain areas. There is less experience with using online surveys, and we need a mixed bag, and we need to develop these methods, targeting them to the right audience in terms of increasing the participation rate, because they are not always representative, but it is as good as we get. And I think given what EFSA has done in terms of harmonizing dietary collection throughout Europe and having a very impressive database, the need for working on these assessment methods and being maybe more forward-thinking than some of the persons like myself who are involved in collecting dietary data on national level is absolutely needed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tua. Thank you very much. So there is also a more of a comment, but it's about the need to link. We need to have a link to health registries. I think this was brought up in the discussions of Group D, and I'm sure in others as well, that in order to be able to have data or to understand data, we need to have access to data in health registries. So I wonder if there is any further comment on that, or the fact that we really take note and make sure that it is considered. I guess this is my reading. It's really common sense and follows from what we had discussed or we were presented this morning. There is also a question about whether or not kinetic aspects have been covered well enough, particularly also in relation to levels in humans. And Ron Hohebaum is the one who's brought up this question. I think we did touch on the need for toxicokinetic and in general kinetic aspects, the need to look at these also in light of the mechanistic information that we have. But maybe exceptionally, I will ask you, Ron, to highlight a little bit more what you would like to have answered here. Ron, would you be willing to say more?
Sure. Yeah, the reason was really that I wasn't sure if it was covered. I was wondering, I think when we look at contaminants, we're also interested in actually the blood levels that are observed in humans. So I think we're pretty good in killing many compounds before they even enter the body. So and for that reason, so it both deals with biomarkers, to what extent are compounds we think are beneficial enter the blood and are really circulating. And the other thing is, can we model that? And yeah, we've mentioned a couple of times the NAMs, the non-animal testing methods. And also there's clearly a need to extrapolate levels that cause effects to in vivo situations. And I think there's really development in this area, and that and also EFSA is involved in several of these activities. I think it was just another issue to take into account.
Yeah.
To do that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. I think what's needed is really that we highlight that point as an important one, because it was discussed in several groups, and I wonder if any of the working group chairs or rapporteurs would like to say more to it. And if not, it's no problem at all. I think it's pretty clear the message that you gave, Ron. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I see here also that there is a discussion about causation, and rather than paraphrasing what was said, I will ask Tor to bring up the idea he brought up in the chat. And when you do so, Tor, please take account of Gina's comment to your observation. It's just under your intervention, your written intervention. Please, Tor.
No, I was just commenting on the causation. It's true that association doesn't mean causation, but I think for these risk-benefit assessment, whether it's whole grains, seafood, or something else, we have wealth of data on benefits of the sort of individual nutrients. But the problem is that we're dealing with food and a complex food matrices, and the sort of research in that area is pretty much based on causation, but where you look at biological relevance and you link the causation based on what you have for the individual nutrients to support. But I think in the risk-benefit assessment, we are working on so small margins that we need to rely on these observational studies to a greater extent than we do for example, setting health-based guidance value for chemicals, because there we can allow ourselves to eliminate risks. But here, and I think the antioxidant supplementation trials in the 90s clearly demonstrated, and there are numerous other trials and also in nutrition, when you look at the rodent studies doing fish oil or whatever nutrient, that the end result is something completely different and incompatible with normal dietary behavior many times. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tor. Thank you very much. I see here also that there is a question about nutrient contaminant and nutrient interactions, and I wonder again, rather than paraphrasing, if Gina, you would like to highlight what you were aiming at, because for me it's several things put in one question, so maybe it's easier if you explain what you are aiming at, what your question is about.
Yes, sure. So I just was wondering, because there are very well-known interactions between nutrients, for example, when we're talking about benefits or less benefit, when we know that, for example, folic acid can mask vitamin B12 levels in blood, for example, or zinc copper interactions where you have a high intake or above the upper limit, and the copper status, nutritional status of a person can be affected because of absorption interactions. So there is also a well-described interactions between different contaminants. We know for some pesticides, there are interactions that, for example, they can be demonstrated synergies between pesticides. But I was thinking, when we divide adverse outcome pathways and benefit outcome pathways, that there are also not isolated, because everything is in food. So I was wondering if there is already something on nutrient contaminant interactions. Can be, for example, the effect of a nutrient or the presence of a nutrient have an effect on the contaminant. Can it be potentiated? Maybe it can be also blocked. So I don't know if there is some evidence, but it's something that is worth to look at.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. I think there is quite a bit of information. When you look at mechanism of action, you will see that there is quite a bit of information on that. You would have, for example, antioxidants being able to block oxidative stress through some contaminants. You would find that, say, glutathione or precursors of glutathione would be able to block the effects of some of the contaminants or other toxic agents. So yes, there is information. The important thing is really how to put it into the whole approach, and that's, I think, also part of what Joseph was referring to when he said, things can feed into the adverse outcome pathway, because you can show how nutrient say contaminant interaction can take place, or beneficial versus toxic interactions can happen in the same pathway. But I see that Dieter has asked for the floor, so Dieter, please go ahead. And while you have the floor, please also at the end mention your question so I don't have to repeat it.
Thank
Could
you.
have a
Thank you,
question.
Margaret. I will do that. So 2 points. One is, hi, Gina. Good to hear you.
Hello.
I'd like to briefly, I mean, Margaret has commented already. In fact, contam panel opinions doing risk assessment of contaminants need to address these interactions. So if you look at the mode of actions in general, all of these interactions, as far as they are published and are known, we have to scrutinize, we have to report, and we have to put into the opinion. That's quite clear. As Margaret has already also said, it's of course then difficult how to translate this into quantitative assessment. How would you modify, let's say, a health-based guidance value on the basis of such interaction? Because the interaction happens maybe in one food item, but maybe not in another, where the interacting agent is present or is not present. That makes things extremely difficult. So what I suggest is that we in the future, in such risk assessment exercises, at least assign a chapter to benefits and possible beneficial interactions of that type. But that is a difficult task. And then now I come directly to my comment to pour some water into the wine. I do not expect that benefits of all kinds in the future may directly modify in a quantitative way the risk measure or the risk metric. How would you do that? I mean, if you have a maximum value, you suggest a maximum value or a TDI for something like methyl mercury, and you see benefits in fish. How would you then increase your TDI? Probably not. But you can provide the information as detailed as possible. We are not nutritionists. We are not experts. What are we going to do as a contam panel in the future? How do we get advice from experts? And that is of course a pragmatic question, practical question. How do we proceed with that? Because I would like to see in the future that these beneficial parts or aspects are covered in our opinions. And I look forward to support and advice who and how we can get support and help in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dieter. I think that's a big challenge. And the question is, also how to do that, whether it is via a sequential approach as is done now, or whether there is a potential for prior interaction. It's a very challenging thing, but it comes later, but it's not to be forgotten for sure. But thank you for your comment. There is a comment that relates to I would say it is more a political question. So the need for consumption data and the need for more compositional data from industry has triggered questions about whether EFSA would be willing to accept, and the public as well, scientific, open to industry providing data on sales of food that could reflect consumption. And it's just a thought, as Candace Dubka says. And then there is another point that is related that says that food purchase data can be used in nutrition to estimate consumption. So one side is really the purchase, which shows us also a bit, and that's certainly something that is important, but also whether or not, data on production and on composition coming from industry would be acceptable for use. I mean, I have an answer, but I would like to throw the question on our colleagues. Dieter, is your hand a legacy, or would you like to answer here?
Sorry, Margaret.
No, don't worry. I would have asked you to answer otherwise. So any of the chairs of the breakout sessions or any of the rapporteurs would like to answer? If not, I would say, I mean, it's, we do use data provided by industry of course, you know, they're subjected to scientific rigor, and they are looked at, and they are. So I think any data are welcome. And if we're asking for composition data, and of course, who else will provide it apart from industry? So I think my answer to that is absolutely yes. And I think the purchase side is covered partly, but not completely. Davide, can I ask you if you can address this point? The purchase, to what extent the purchase?
I mean,
Yeah.
all data could be useful. I mean, and mixing. Well, often the best approach is to have information from different sources and put them together. The main issue with purchase data is that they are mainly they are mainly available at household level. So you know, I mean, you know, someone buying food for the family, but then you don't know who actually has consumed that food and when. If yes, 3 kilos of apples were consumed only by one member of the family in one day, or actually they were shared in 1 week.
Yeah.
So this is probably something that it's difficult. And with respect to food composition data, it's interesting. We are using the Mintel database. We use this kind of information, but one of the challenges, something that I still didn't get, is how much of the data on the label are coming from national food composition data, you know, because often they are not, analyzing their own food. They are just calculating the nutrient from the national food composition data. So making national food composition data stronger, more accurate, more updated could also be an added value for the industry.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that's a very compelling argument. I see also that Jean-Charles has put in the chat that currently there is no interest in purchase data in EFSA, but as David said, I think it's really indirect through the Mintel database. But maybe, Jean-Charles, you'd like to say something about that, about your views?
Not really, no. I think we don't, there is no specifically need in our EFSA activity or even in data needed for risk benefit assessment to go with purchase data. It's clearly what we currently use at international level, as you know, because we do not have individual data for all UN member states. So it's useful at that level, but not really for us. I don't really see interest personally.
Right, and I see also a comment saying that such purchase data will not be individual, but will give a national picture, and that is certainly an important point. Now, let me move on to another point that Jose has raised, which is addressing the additional benefits of NAM studies versus animal studies. And Jose says that they offer the possibility of addressing susceptible population groups. And I wonder, Jose, if you would like to add some more to that.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, it's some of the elements that we are discussing in the EFSA roadmap for NAMs. If we are using more the human data and human cells that have been collected from the specific individuals, even the possibility for organ on the chip from different groups of individuals, and there are even databases for human cells to be able to have that derivation, will be closer to the human population. So the problem, one of the problems for the toxicity studies with animals is that we are starting with a healthy population of animals. If the animals are not healthy, we take out from the study, but that is not the situation for humans. I think that particularly for risk-benefit analysis, it will be important to see what is the current status of the population instead of what is the health status, and try to have something that can inform both on the risk as well as the benefits for this population according to a healthy status. That will not be the maximum, never, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, thank you, Jose. I think that makes sense. I think NAMs offer a lot of possibilities seen in the context, of course, of the whole picture, but it's certainly the way to in the future that will make more.
And one of the elements that we are discussing that is specifically relevant for EFSA because it's specifically relevant in the food and feed area. In most of the cases, we will have also animal studies, and in some cases, we'll have epidemiological studies. So we are not considering to do risk assessment using NAMs only. We can just read across from other chemicals that are closely related, either contaminants or nutrients. So it's the combination of all the information and try to use NAMs for fulfilling the data gaps. I think that can be the future.
Thank you, Jose. That's very useful. Going back to the issue before of the purchase data, I think one important point that has been raised also in the chat is that if we consider food waste at household level, then the purchase data may not give us an accurate information, apart from the fact that we don't know who in a household is eating what. We also don't know how much of it is thrown away. So it's a little bit of an additional uncertainty, and I think this is a point worth considering. Okay, I think we've exhausted the questions for this morning's plenary, and my feeling is that people are also ready for the lunch break. So you've gained yourself 4 minutes. We'll break now for lunch for 1 hour, and I hope that you come back all at 2 o'clock. Is it 2 o'clock? Yes, 2 o'clock Central European time, and then we will, we will have the final session, which will not take too long, just to identify the take-home messages. With that, thank you very much. And if it had been evening, Dita, I would have said, as long as you don't throw water in my Portuguese or Spanish wine, I'm fine.
I promise.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll see you all then in an hour's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggot.
Hey, good afternoon, colleagues. I'd like to welcome you all to the final session, which is the closing or the wrap-up and closing session. It's a pleasure to have had all of these wonderful discussions over the 2 days or 1.5 days so far. And what we would like to do now is, first of all, give you a summary of the outcome of our discussions in the breakout sessions and in the plenaries so far. And some of it will be a repetition of what we've done yesterday, but the important is that we really put together all of the summaries of the breakout session groups. And in order to do so, I invite Luisa to give a presentation. Thank you, Luisa.
Yes, thank you, Maggot. Wait a second. Can you let me know if you can see the slides?
Yes, we can. Just
okay. I will make it in presentation mode.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So here, just a brief summary of the main points that were touched in each of the breakout sessions and in the plenary discussions afterwards. So the first breakout session was about needs. Can a risk-benefit assessment be performed that would better support the development of dietary advice? In this slide, you can see the main points we catch that were common to the several breakout groups. So it was again and again highlighted the importance of problem formulation. So to frame the risk-benefit analysis as narrow as possible for a useful answer. That there should be a constant and it should be an iterative interaction between risk assessors and risk managers. It should be a scenario-based approach, and these scenarios should be ideally provided by the risk managers. Another thing that was coming up after an advert was the need for common metrics and how to get there. Also, uncertainty was raised that is different for the risk and the benefits and how they are assessed and quantified and how would this influence. The roles of the risk assessors and the risk managers in this risk benefit exercise, and also the communication was highlighted as of utmost importance. Regarding breakout session 2 about the methods weighing health risk and health benefits of combined exposure to different contaminants and nutrients through consumption of particular foods in specific regions across Europe. So their main points raised were the focus on improving current risk-benefit analysis and methods that would rank, prioritize, and select the components to be included in the analysis. This with the aim to reduce variability of experts' opinions and time needed. And of course, to provide transparency in the choice of these components. Again, the importance of the problem formulation, clarity on the purpose of the risk-benefit analysis. Again, population-based approach and discussions about the DALIs and the QALYs and its limitations were held, but also these were acknowledged as that they can integrate indicators and compare parameters and scenarios, but adjustment is needed. Other approaches and considerations that were made in this respect is the considerations of probabilistic methods, the use of the margin of exposure for risk-benefit analysis, the integration of alternative lines of evidence, and this has also been discussed today, including NAMs, the compilation or the application of various approaches, so the common metrics plus the reference values approach, the need of weight of evidence to integrate both risk and benefits, whether it would be useful to develop what was called beneficial equivalency factors, and also suggestions for tailored risk-benefit analysis, for example, for genotoxic carcinogenic chemicals, for unavoidable chemicals and intentionally added chemicals, and also, again, scenarios for different endpoints and populations, depending whether they refer to the same age group population and health effects. And coming out of the breakout session 3, the one of today on the data, collection of data and other information for a risk-benefit assessment that would support the development of dietary advice. So the main points raised there was that current data and methods can be used, but might not be sufficient for both risk and benefit characterization. So there is a need of up-to-date, representative and tailored data for the objectives of a particular risk-benefit analysis. And again, that the objectives of this risk-benefit analysis determines the data needs, so there is a need of a clear roadmap. Another item that was mentioned by all groups was the harmonization at EU level on data collection and data generation, both on contaminants and nutrients using comparable methodologies. This should be an international joint effort by competent authorities. There should be available open and structured databases containing all the needed information for this risk-benefit analysis. And there was also suggestions for harmonized DALIs and QALYs at international level, and that it should be transparently provided what are the underlying assumptions for these DALIs. Need of more detailed and updated food composition data, including novel food or less known foods. And regarding the occurrence and consumption data, a number of aspects were raised. The influence of processing is very important. The availability of data at national level for these more regional scenarios, and whether instead EU level data could be used, and how could this influence. Consumption data that need to cover more age groups, and there should be a harmonization about the age groups considered. They should be able to capture changes in preferences and diets, more coverage of long-term exposure, usefulness of food frequency questionnaires, etc. There were also a number of comments on total diet studies that are lacking for nutrient assessment. They are not performing in all countries, and they should be promoted and harmonized. One of the breakout groups also discussed on what to do in the case of lack of data. Do we extrapolate, design tailored studies, and the pros and cons should be considered of these options. Toxicokinetic data and its possible link to internal exposure. Also a number of comments on EPI studies, their usefulness and their limitations. and also about how the mechanistic data, or if the mechanistic data could serve as this common metric for the risk-benefit analysis. Several comments on the development of outcome pathways for the assessment also of nutrients, whether this is feasible or not, use of QSAR in silico tools, NAMs again, and nutrient-contaminant interaction. And also the combination of these TDS for contaminants and nutrients and linking with the human biomonitoring, biomarkers and AOPs or BOPs. And Margaret, I think this is all from my side.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Brilliant presentation, and I think you've captured also the main points of session 3 very well. Colleagues, we have a few minutes. If anybody has a pertinent point that you would like to bring up at this point in terms of the discussion point raised, if we have left out anything of very important, of great importance or not, of course, we will take into account the whole discussion that we had. And if not, I'll wait a bit. It doesn't seem to be the case, and there is nothing with being able to close early, but before moving into my reading of the take-home messages, which are the main messages, all of these summary points are take-home messages, but I will get to those in a minute. I would like to ask Frans van Straten from the European Commission, because of course the trigger came from your side. If you have any comments on the discussion points that were raised so far, and in particular on the fact that there is a feeling that DALIs and QUALIs can still be used, but need to be improved. So Frans, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and well, of course, I will not go into details of all the aspects of what methodologies have to be used. What we learned in the past 2 days is that indeed it is a complex exercise, what we already knew in advance, but this has certainly been confirmed. For me, the major issues, what I have learned in the past 2 days, is that it is important upfront, indeed, to clearly discuss risk managers, risk assessors, and the problem definition. Also, well, indeed, what you said and what was also mentioned in one of the breakout sessions, that indeed a scenario-based approach with input from the risk managers, that it is, while we indeed would like to have as I also mentioned in my presentation on Tuesday afternoon, a comprehensive approach. On the other hand, we have also to know that, yeah, you can load your wagon so much that indeed at the end the wheels clashes and you go nowhere. And so it's important that we have an assessment, a risk-benefit assessment, as comprehensive as possible, and not covering only one contaminant, but looking at all contaminants or major contaminants. But on the other hand, the outcome must also be then indeed something which is useful and not full of uncertainties. That is also important. And what I also learned is that indeed it is important that in this risk-benefit analysis, also within Europe, the regional differences are taken into account. And that's important as well, because we have these both objectives, indeed, that the risk-benefit assessment is indeed the basis for, I would say, developing or indeed formulating a dietary advice by our national authorities in the EU. But also, as I said, it is for us at the Commission level important to see, indeed, when we are setting maximum levels according to the ALARA principle, that we can say, okay, we are setting them at this level. We know that it's for certain consumption patterns, and if you look at the health-based guidance value or any other, indeed, or the MOE, it might be not fully health protective, but indeed it is appropriate because we know the beneficial effects of consumption and also the risks related when you have not these beneficial effects. And because that is also important, because we get also at the risk management level, regularly the comment that's saying, okay, we do large recalls from a food on the market exceeds a certain maximum level, while indeed we leave foods on the market which contains much higher levels, but blind because the maximum level is much higher. And then this question regularly comes up, but it is indeed important to explain that in the frame of indeed the benefits of having this food on the market, and also in relation to what is as low as reasonable achievable. So in fact, I think what this colloquium has highlighted, that there is that indeed when initially we discussed with EFSA the time frame for this risk benefit analysis, and that indeed, well, we talked about 2024, 2025. That was indeed showing that indeed, oh, that's still 3-4 years is, and as a risk manager, we want always to have a quick answer. But I think also this colloquium has also shown that there are so many aspects to be looked upon. It's such a complex exercise that indeed these 3 or 4 years will be even a challenge to finalize the task, even with intensive discussions. And I already thank Maggot to drive indeed the working group and all people involved in the exercise towards indeed a useful outcome. And with that, I think that is my main message I want to give, and which first of all to thank indeed everyone for cooperative participation in this exercise, and we look forward at the final outcome, so that we have indeed a risk-benefit assessment which is useful for all EU member states, and I would say also indeed inclusive for all member states, so that afterwards we do not say, well, it is not as applicable for our situation or not. So it should be indeed inclusive for all EU member states and even beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franz. I think it's very wise words, and also I thank you for the understanding, of the limitations of science and the limitation of methodology. But we will do our best, of course, to give you the best advice that we can. Thank you very much. And with that, let me move to the take-home messages, which of course are not conclusive 100%, but they cover some of the major issues that we need to pay attention to. And I see also that there are some comments in the chat, like
yes,
the data needs for communication. This is something that we need certainly to include. But I encourage you to add whatever you can, colleagues, if that you see that we've missed on, and then we will discuss it. But let me then go to a kind of overview type of final take-home messages. Again, not comprehensive, but at least the main points. I think everybody is clear about the fact that problem formulation is key, and that we need a clear problem formulation, and that should be, of course, done in collaboration with the risk managers, and it needs iterative refinement. If we stop at the point of here's the problem, go ahead, it won't help. My understanding is we'll go into an iterative process where we can refine the questions as we go along. There was also a major outcome of the overall discussion is that current methodologies are still useful, but that they can and should be improved. It doesn't mean that we have to stick to the current methodologies, but we should not throw them out. We need to improve them. They are not perfect, but there are possibilities, of course, and openings for new and additional methods for risk-benefit assessment. There is more work needed to define practicable common metrics. I think the common metrics have come up in every place, be it the data needs, be it the methodology, and be it even the needs. We need to talk in terms of common metrics, and we need to be able to transfer whatever data we have into these common metrics. We need more data everywhere, and these data should be targeted as possible. Population-based are preferable, but of course we will not, throw out any individual-based data. And all data need to be harmonized between member states, harmonized in terms of, the approaches that are taken for scientific developments, harmonized in every way. So data are needed, and data should follow certain rules. Mechanistic information was seen to improve the picture in all areas, be it in epidemiology, where we talked about the need for maybe biomarker studies, more biomarker studies, be it in nutrition, be it in the application of NAMs. Mechanistic information seems to be really of great importance, seems to be the future, and that includes, again, it doesn't necessarily do it when I say only mechanistic information, but kinetics and even dynamic information is important. These data can lead into the application of AOPs, and I think the application of AOPs was seen as an approach that would facilitate the use of data at various levels, both on the benefit side and on the adverse effect side. And we talked also about the fact that it could be, also an adverse outcome pathway could be used to show the beneficial effects at various levels of the propagation of the adverse effects. So here again, a very broad kind of area that we've covered, and I think it's very important, and it's also looking into the future and using new knowledge, new approaches, and of course, new data that could be new, that could be, harnessed out of existing big data and the rest. There's a need to collaborate on data generation, data exchange, and data use, and that is between research institutions, between regulatory institutions, between countries in general. And overall, all methodologies, that is something that I could hear through the discussions, should remain flexible and open to improvement. There is never a work that is finalized. There is always a work that has come to a certain point and is still open for improvements. I think these are my final take-home messages. And with that, I would like really, from my side, to thank all the participants, to thank particularly those who have prepared for the meeting. We've been there to support us. First of all, on the technical side, I think this meeting has run in such a harmonious and easy way that they ought to be congratulated on their technical support. Thank you very much. Of course, the colleagues at EFSA from the teams who have done an amazing work before, during, and will be doing after the meeting as well. Of course, all of the breakout session chairs have been wonderful, and certainly the rapporteurs who have done also an excellent job, and all of the speakers that we had on the first day. And with that, with my great thanks, I would like to hand over to Claudia Roncancio, to close the meeting. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Margaret. And now it's, I would say, very easy job, because after the brilliant presentation from Luisa, after all your words, I can just echo congratulations to all the colleagues, and a big thanks to all the participants. Very good take-home messages, very good concluding remarks. But we finish here the meeting, but it's time for EFSA to take these messages at our level, at unit level. We also hear a lot about communication internally and with the communication department and with the Commission. So for me, it has been really a great opportunity to be in the backside, but listening to the different discussions. Hope we can see in the near future, and probably it's an opportunity for me to invite you to check our website. We have the registration is open for the EFSA Conference 2022. It's a 4-day event taking place from 21st to 24th of June. Registrations for physical participation are open until the 29th of April. It's a hybrid event, so physical and virtual, co-organized between EFSA, ECA, EMA, GRC, ECDC, EEA. So I hope that we have that as a next opportunity to meet again, to continue discussing on this and on so many other issues, because as you will see, the program is full of different events, opportunities to network and to listen to many different activities and participation to different tasks. And from our side, thanks again. We have also take-home messages. Also, Margaret, I think for you, your commission brought a message also for you as chair of this working group. And thanks a lot, especially Jean and Maria from the message unit that have been preparing all of this. Thank you to you all, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Thanks. Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks to everybody.
We close the meeting now. Thanks again.
Thank
you.
Also, I cannot see you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Now you're coming, yeah.
Yeah, they are coming just to take.